So in this video today, we're going to be breaking down a song by Fred again. It's called 10. I wanted to go through the track today, recreate the track itself, and we're going to break it down into the individual parts and work out why it is such a captivating track. So just the overall general structure in terms of the tempo, we're about 128 beats per minute. Overall, the track contains a lot of samples built in. The main melody, some of the vocals as well, and the actual vocal by the artist Jozzy. I think that's how you pronounce it anyway. That vocal isn't a sample, that's a recording of course, but most of the rest of the track is made up of samples, and that's why it has that nostalgic feel. So first of all, let's talk about the key of the song. Now, after recreating the chords here, as we can see, it seemed to me that the track is in the key of B minor. That's what it gravitates around the most. But in actual fact, the key of the track could also be G Lydian, which is one of the modes. Because if we look at the notes in our clip here of our chords, that's the main melody in the background of the song, and all these notes are in the key of B minor. One interesting point about the chords here is that the first chord itself starts on a G major chord. So if I change my scale over here from B minor to G Lydian, B minor and G Lydian have exactly the same notes in each of their scales. But as you can see now, our first chord lines up on that root note of G. So the track could be seen as being in B minor, or it could be seen as in G Lydian. G Lydian has a slightly different feel to B minor, but we'll focus on that in a minute when we talk about the chords themselves. I'm going to remove all of the lower notes from these chords. I want to talk about the main melody in the instrumental, which is this flute line here. And I'm going to go back into B minor just to talk about this melody. Seems like it was written towards that B minor scale more than anything. The first note in our melody is on our root note there of B. Then we jump up to the seventh note and we go back down to the third, the second, third. And the melody itself is quite simple overall. The rhythmic structure of the melody is quite repetitive, as we can see. Now there are some slight changes as we go along from one bar to the next, which keeps that melody sounding fresh and not too repetitive. But all of these notes within the melody, if we change our key scale down here from B minor to B minor pentatonic, they all live in that minor pentatonic scale apart from that C sharp, as you can see there. So if you're looking to write a melody, try using a pentatonic scale. But we've got these C sharps in here just to add a little bit of extra spice to our melody. I want to show you the big differences I was talking about before between B minor and G Lydian. I'm actually going to just remove all of these lower chord notes. I'm going to place the root note of B minor, a B, draw a big long note across the whole of our melody, and have a listen to what the melody sounds like now. It changes the tone of that melody quite dramatically. This is a really big part of composition, and this is what we cover in our music composition course too. Bass notes or lower notes within a chord or a melody dictate how the notes above it sound. For example, if we start to move this bass note around, we bring it down to that G that we were talking about before. The melody on top changes again. We could change this once more. And this is just because the relationship between that lowest note and our melody is constantly changing. And so if we compare now that bass note to our melody, we look at this first note here and the note above. They're both Bs, they're exactly the same. In comparison from the second note to our B here, this is the seventh note in the scale. This seventh note has a little bit of a tense, dissonant feel. We can hear this if we just loop around this region. And in order to dispel that tension, the note after this is our D note here, which would be a minor third interval. So having this in here brings us back to stability. But what happens when we change that bass note down to the G? All of those intervals now change. So our first note of B is now our major third interval. The A up here now becomes our second note, because as you can see, we have a G just below it here. And now when we go back down to the D this time, this is now our perfect fifth interval, which is another very stable note interval. It's about that idea of going from stability to tension back to stability. But let's go all the way back. Now that we've learned a little bit about how the reharmonizing works, let's go all the way back. And this is the actual chord structure, or close enough, but this is an approximation of what the melody and the chords underneath it sound like. And so all the bass note and the lower half of our chord is doing is it's jumping between our G major chord at the beginning, our B minor chord. It's just jumping back and forth between the two until the very end of this section where it drops to the F sharp. And that is just a leading note, bringing us back around to the beginning to our G again. So this is why the key of the track could be seen as being in G Lydian rather than B minor, because we start on that G major chord. Now, one of the big things about this flute sequence is the subtle variation that takes place throughout the whole 8 or 16 bar sequence throughout the track. In the second 4 bars, at the end of the 4 bars, there is another slight change. This chord here, where we go from our standard melody. In that final bar, we just accentuate this third chord, the F sharp chord here. And this F sharp chord is just our root note, our fifth, and then another fifth on top of that to provide some stability before we go back around to the beginning. The bass line itself is rather simple. It just follows the lowest note of those chords that we created above. The bass part itself, we've added a little bit of glide or portamento, but we'll come on to the sound design stuff a little bit later on. But nothing too complex with the bass. And this is an important thing to note. When you're writing bass lines and chords, I like to stick to this idea of keeping contrast between our instruments. So our flute sample at the top is quite complex, both rhythmically and harmonically. So in comparison to that, the bass line needs to be quite simple to not detract from the other flute sample. If we had a very complex bass line as well as our complex flutes, you're going to run into problems of the listener focusing on multiple areas in the song, and it's just going to get confusing. It's going to feel overwhelming. So that's it for the bass. Let's talk now about, in the first half of the song, there is a chopped up vocal snippet from what sounds like the actual recording of the verse later on. I have recreated the melody in a synthesizer here. Let me just play that with the rest of the track. There's nothing super complex going on here, and obviously the synthesizer doesn't sound anywhere close to the original vocal. Let's just change over our scale again to the B minor pentatonic. And once again, you can see all of those notes are in the pentatonic scale. I know I keep saying this, but if you're trying to write melodies, start with the pentatonic scale and then expand outwards after that. Now let's compare our melody here to the chords that we have underneath. I'll just draw the chords in. So first note here, perfect fifth away. Second note, minor third. Nearly got that one wrong. And it does this flourish of notes going up to the perfect fourth, then the perfect fifth, back to the fourth, and then back to our minor third again. You start to get the idea. A lot of the notes, a lot of the melodies are focused around the lowest note within the chord, the third and the fifth notes within those chords. Add in a few seconds, fourths and seventh notes just to add a little bit of tension and release. Generally always resolving back to one of those nice intervals. Now the thing about this vocal melody, it seems to be made from a chopped up a cappella or sample. And you could do this yourself. This is something that, again, we cover on our music composition courses, retuning an a cappella to fit within the key of our song and then being able to chop it up to create melodies, harmonies, etc. I did this actually with a vocal sample here. And it's really a great way to generate melodies because you can just chop them up, rearrange them and find which parts fit. Even though they are in the same key, some melodies might not work with certain chords and things like that, but it is a really good way of creating melodies, and it's what Fred again uses a lot within his songs.